Avoidants use silence as control, distance, and emotional protection. It's their shield, their escape hatch, their way of creating space when emotions feel too heavy and closeness feels too demanding. In their world, silence is supposed to reset things, to let them breathe without feeling overwhelmed, to keep the connection from getting too close too fast, too real. But when the empath mirrors that silence, something shifts in the dynamic in a way the avoidant never saw coming. Suddenly, the silence they once used as a buffer begins to close in on them. It no longer feels like a safe zone, it feels like a void they unintentionally created and now have to sit alone with. They expected the empath to reach out, to soothe the gap, to fix the tension like they always do. They expected the familiar cycle, the avoidant withdraws, the empath leans in. But this time, the empath doesn't chase. This time, the empath matches the distance with their own quiet, and that quiet is louder than any words ever were.
That's when the avoidant realizes the silence is no longer theirs. It now belongs to both of you. And this mutual silence carries a completely different weight. It isn't comforting. It isn't controlled. It isn't predictable. It's a silence they can't manage or manipulate. It's a silence that forces them to feel instead of hide. It forces them to look at the reality of the connection without escape routes or emotional shortcuts. For maybe the first time, the avoidant isn't the one choosing the distance. The distance is choosing them, and the power they thought silence gave them starts slipping through their fingers. The dynamic that once made them feel safe becomes the very thing that threatens the stability of the bond. Because when the empath stops explaining, stops clarifying, stops soothing the tension, the avoidant loses the illusion of control they relied on. The moment an empath stops explaining, the avoidant loses the illusion of control. In that moment, something in the avoidant begins to fracture. The silence that once protected them suddenly exposes them. It exposes the fear they've always tried to outrun, the fear of not being enough, of being unlovable, of being emotionally incapable. They start to realize that the empath's silence isn't passive, it isn't weak, it isn't avoidance, it's a choice. And that choice carries a message. The avoidant can no longer ignore, I won't carry this connection alone anymore. This shift shakes the avoidant more deeply than any argument, confrontation, or emotional demand ever could, because the empath's silence signals something they've depended on finally breaking. The emotional labor the empath has been doing, the reassurance, the over-explaining, the repairing is gone. And with that gone, the avoidant can no longer hide behind the comfort of knowing the empath will always come back. They can no longer depend on being pursued, validated, or emotionally rescued. The silence becomes a mirror reflecting their own patterns back to them, showing them how much they've taken comfort in the empath's consistency, patience, and emotional generosity. Suddenly, the silence feels dangerous. Not because the empath is punishing them, but because the empath has reached a level of clarity, a level of self-protection, a level of strength. And that's what truly unsettles the avoidant, the realization that the empath isn't withdrawing out of hurt, but out of growth. The empath isn't going silent to make a point. They're going silent because they've finally understood the avoidance limits and chosen not to push past them anymore. This is when the avoidant begins to collapse internally, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet recognition of what their silence has cost them. For the first time, they feel the weight of losing someone who loved without conditions, someone who stayed through the storms, someone who held space for all the emotions they were too afraid to feel. And now that person is silent, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. And that silence, the one they once used as a weapon, becomes the one thing they can't outrun. Avoidants expect you to reach out, fix things, and soften the distance. It's the cycle they've grown comfortable with. They pull away and the empath reaches in. They shut down and the empath opens up. They withdraw and the empath closes the gap with reassurance, understanding, and emotional effort. This pattern creates a sense of emotional predictability for the avoidant. Even if they'll never admit it, it lets them feel like they can disappear without consequences, like the connection will hold even if they don't. But when the empath finally steps back instead of leaning in, when they choose silence instead of soothing, the avoidance nervous system registers it as danger. Suddenly, the very thing that once felt safe, space, quiet, distance, begins to feel like abandonment. When you don't reach out, their nervous system flips, safety becomes threat. What used to calm them
now activates their deepest fears. The avoidance mind, which is built on emotional self-protection, instantly starts scanning for danger. Did I push too far? Is this silence different? Is this the moment everything finally comes apart? They won't say it out loud, but internally, the shift is dramatic. Your silence interrupts the pattern they were relying on. It forces them into emotional territory they've spent their entire life avoiding: uncertainty, vulnerability, self-reflection. Their mind goes, did I push too far? Is this silence final? And that question isn't just about losing you. It's about losing the emotional safety net your presence provided. The empath wasn't just a partner. They were a buffer, a stabilizer, a translator. The empath softened every emotional impact the avoidant didn't know how to handle. They offered reassurance without being asked, connection without pressure, love without conditions. And when that suddenly disappears, the avoidant feels it like a shockwave. Not because they suddenly know how to express it, but because their inner world, the one they thought they could control through distance, begins to destabilize. Avoidants don't fear losing you, they fear realizing you were willing to walk. That's the deepest cut. Because in their eyes, empaths don't leave. Empaths don't detach. Empaths don't go quiet. So when the empath finally becomes silent, it tells the avoidant one thing they were never prepared to face. You reached your breaking point. And the avoidant understands, even if they can't say it, that your silence is not indifference. It's a boundary. It's a shift from emotional giving to emotional neutrality, and that shift terrifies them. Avoidants don't fear losing you. They fear realizing you were willing to walk. When the empath withdraws, the avoidant's internal narrative changes. Suddenly, the safe distance they always ran to doesn't feel safe at all. It feels like losing grip on something they didn't know they depended on. The avoidant begins to replay every moment leading up to the silence. The cold responses, the pulled back energy, the walls they thought would protect them. They begin to realize those walls didn't just keep others out. They pushed away the one person who understood them. And your silence makes that truth unavoidable. What's ironic is that avoidants spend so much time fearing engulfment, fearing closeness, fearing vulnerability, yet nothing terrifies them more than the moment you stop trying, the moment you stop reaching, the moment your energy shifts from connection to neutrality, because that's when they recognize that the Shiban empath's silence is not weaponized. It's not manipulation. It's not a test. It's acceptance. Acceptance that the avoidant cannot meet them where they are. Acceptance that the emotional burden is no longer sustainable. Acceptance that love cannot thrive in one direction. This is where the avoidant begins to collapse internally. The silence forces them to sit with themselves, with their patterns, with the damage created by their own defenses. And for the first time, they feel the weight of losing something real, not because you left with anger, but because you left with quiet. The empath's silence becomes the most powerful truth the avoidant has ever had to face. You were willing to walk away from what was hurting you, and that realization shakes them more deeply than any confrontation ever could. Avoidants fear engulfment, but their deeper fear is unworthiness. Most people never see that part of them. On the surface, avoidants look distant, self-contained, unbothered, even indifferent. But underneath that protective exterior is a wound formed long before adult relationships, a wound that whispers they are too difficult to love, too complicated to understand, too flawed to stay with. So they build walls, distance, and emotional escape routes, not because they don't care, but because caring feels dangerous. Closeness feels like a test. They believe they're destined to fail. So when the empath suddenly withdraws, when the warmth they relied on goes quiet, the avoidance unworthiness wound ignites in a way they can't ignore. When the empath goes quiet, that wound is exposed. Silence to an avoidant is not neutral. It's an emotional mirror reflecting back everything they've tried not to feel. It forces them to sit with the belief they've carried since childhood. I'm not enough for someone to stay, and though they'll never say it out loud, the shift hits them like a tidal wave. Your silence doesn't just create distance, it strips away the emotional cushioning you always provided. The explanations, the patience, the reassurances, all the things that made their fears easier to manage suddenly disappear. And without that emotional buffer, the avoidant is left face to face with the raw, unfiltered truth they've spent their whole life avoiding. They begin replaying past patterns: rejection, abandonment, failure. Your silence triggers every old story they've buried, not consciously, but somatically. The body remembers what the mind denies. The avoidant starts reliving the emotional memories that shaped their attachment style, the feeling of being dismissed, overlooked, misunderstood, or too much for the people they once depended on. Their mind connects your silence to moments where they felt unwanted or forgotten, even though the situations are completely different. But emotions don't follow logic, they follow wounds, and your silence hits the deepest one. The avoidant begins a quiet internal spiral, the kind no one sees but every avoidant recognizes. The thoughts sound like, I messed this up. They're done with me. This feels familiar, too familiar. That what they feel isn't just fear of losing you, it's the fear of facing every emotional truth they've tried to outrun through withdrawal, shutdown, and emotional distance. Your silence doesn't punish them. It awakens them. It exposes the emotional reality beneath their defenses. They wanted closeness more than they ever admitted, but they didn't know how to handle it without losing themselves. Your silence awakens every memory they tried to outrun. What's even more painful for the avoidant is realizing that the empath's quiet isn't reactive, it's reflective. It shows strength, self-respect, and emotional clarity. The empath isn't slamming doors, making demands, or fighting. They're simply stepping back into their own energy. And that level of grounded withdrawal reminds the avoidant of something they've always feared: that love can exist without being chased, and connection can end without chaos. The silence becomes a sign of emotional maturity. The avoidant wasn't prepared to match. In that quiet space, the avoidant begins to understand, not logically, but emotionally, that they were never being engulfed. They were being cared for. They weren't being pressured. They were being chosen. They weren't being controlled. They were being loved consistently and without conditions. And now that love is no longer reaching for them. That's what shatters them internally. The empath's withdrawal proves something. The avoidant always believed deep down. People leave when they finally see the real them. This is the moment where many avoidants begin their internal collapse, not because the empath is gone, but because the silence has forced them to confront the truth they've avoided their entire life. They weren't running from you. They were running from the fear that you'd one day run from them. Empaths stabilize the connection emotionally. They're the steady presence, the soft landing, the one who can feel the emotional temperature of the relationship before the avoidant even recognizes there is one. They understand the avoidance pauses, interpret their distance, and translate their silence into something that makes sense. Empaths are the emotional compass guiding, balancing, grounding. And for the avoidant who struggles with internal turbulence, this emotional steadiness becomes something they unconsciously depend on. It becomes the thing that keeps the connection from completely unraveling every time they pull away, but they never acknowledge it. They never express it. In fact, many avoidants convince themselves they don't need that steadiness at all until suddenly the empath goes quiet. When that anchor disappears, the avoidant feels ungrounded. It's not just the loss of communication, it's the loss of emotional equilibrium. The connection no longer has someone regulating its intensity, smoothing its edges, or breathing life into moments. The avoidant disconnects from without the empath's emotional presence. The avoidant is left with nothing but their own unbalanced, unprocessed feelings, something they've spent their entire life trying to avoid. The silence becomes disorienting. The distance becomes heavy. And for the first time, the avoidant has to sit in the emotional space the empath always held for both of them. This is where the collapse begins. Not outwardly, avoidants rarely break publicly. Their collapse is internal, quiet, invisible to everyone, but deeply felt within. They lose the person who translated their distance into understanding. The empath wasn't just forgiving them, they were interpreting them. They weren't just patient, they were emotionally bilingual. Reading the avoidance withdrawal as fear, not rejection, seeing the shutdown as overwhelm, not disinterest, understanding the silence as protection, not punishment. And when that understanding disappears, the avoidant realizes how much of themselves the empath was carrying for them. The loss of that emotional translation is devastating, even if the avoidant can't articulate why. Because now when they pull back, there is no one bridging the gap. There is no one softening the impact. There is no one turning their emotional absence into something meaningful. They begin to feel the consequences of their own patterns in real time. Confusion instead of clarity, anxiety instead of relief, emptiness instead of space. What once felt like emotional freedom now feels like emotional freefall. Avoidants don't collapse because you left, they collapse because your presence kept them together. What breaks them is not the empath's exit. It's the realization of what the empath's presence actually did. Empath didn't just love them. They stabilized them. They didn't just care. They compensated. They didn't just show up. They held the emotional weight the avoidant didn't know how to hold. And without that anchor, the avoidant begins to drift into emotional waters. They have no idea how to navigate. They feel the emptiness of their own silence, the sharpness of their own distance, the consequences of their own self-protection. They realize the empath wasn't overwhelming them. The empath was grounding them. But suddenly the avoidant sees the full picture. The connection didn't feel safe because they kept running. It felt safe because the empath kept waiting. It didn't survive because the avoidant maintained it. It survived because the empath understood it. And now that stabilizing force is gone. This is the moment of collapse when the avoidant finally understands that the empath wasn't weak for holding on. They were brave. They weren't clingy for caring deeply. They were constant. They weren't trying too hard. They were keeping the connection alive in ways the avoidant never recognized until it was too late. And once an avoidant realizes the empath was the emotional anchor all along, the silence becomes unbearable. Not because you left, but because they finally understand what your presence truly meant. No more blame, no more excuses, no more emotional shortcuts. Avoidants spend most of their life convinced that their walls protect them, that distance keeps them safe, that silence prevents conflict, that emotional shutdowns preserve control. They tell themselves stories to justify the pattern. I just need space. I'm better alone. They're too emotional. This connection is too intense. But these are survival beliefs, not truths. Their walls were built in childhood, shaped by wounds, designed to keep pain out, but they also keep love out. And for the longest time, the avoidant never has to face that reality. Why? Because the empath constantly cushions the impact. The empath absorbs the distance, interprets the silence, and carries the emotional burden. As long as the empath keeps showing up, the avoidant never has to look at what their behavior really costs. But then your silence arrives. And silence is the one thing they can't reason away. Silence forces them to confront what their defenses cost them. Without the empath's warmth, patience, and steady presence, the avoidant is left alone with the truth they've avoided for years. The truth that their distance didn't protect them, it isolated them. Their silence didn't create peace, it created disconnection. Their walls didn't keep the relationship safe, they slowly suffocated it. And now, for the first time, there's no one to bridge the gap, no one to interpret their withdrawal, no one to explain away the hurt. The avoidant has to sit in the empty space they created with their own hands. This is when the emotional mirror turns on them. This is when the collapse begins. Because when your silence replaces their walls, they see themselves clearly, and that clarity breaks them. It's brutal, not loud, quiet, not dramatic. It's the kind of truth that hits in waves. Wave 1, I did this. Wave 2, I pushed away someone who cared. Wave 3, I thought distance kept me safe, but it cost me everything. And those realizations don't go away, they echo. What hurts the avoidant most is the sudden shift from feeling in control to feeling responsible. They can't hide behind the narrative that you were too much, that the relationship was too intense, or that they just needed space, because your silence proved something they weren't ready to face. You weren't overwhelming them, you were accommodating them. You weren't pressuring them, you were trying to connect. You weren't demanding too much, you were asking for the bare minimum. Your silence strips the dynamic down to its core truth. The avoidant didn't lose the empath because the empath was difficult. They lost the empath because the empath got tired of carrying the relationship alone. And in that realization, the avoidant feels the weight of every defense mechanism they thought made them strong. The walls that once felt protective now feel suffocating. The silence that once felt safe now feels empty. The distance that once comforted them now feels like failure. What they built to survive becomes the very thing that breaks them. This is the emotional cost avoidance never want to face. They didn't avoid you, they avoided themselves. And losing you is what finally exposes the truth. It wasn't the connection that hurt them, it was the way they kept running from it. Your silence becomes the turning point, the moment their emotional strategy collapses and the truth stands alone. They didn't protect themselves by pushing you away. They punished themselves by losing the one person who made closeness feel safe. Empaths don't go silent to hurt. Silence is never their first language. They're the ones who explain, clarify, soothe, and reach out, even when they are hurting. Empaths feel deeply, communicate openly, and try tirelessly to understand the emotional world of the person they love. So when an empath finally goes silent, it's not retaliation. It's not revenge. It's not a strategy to scare the avoidant into caring. It's a sign that something fundamental has shifted inside them. Silence for an empath is not a weapon, it's a conclusion. They go silent when they finally understood the avoidant won't meet them emotionally. This realization doesn't happen suddenly. It builds slowly over time. Every unanswered message, every cold withdrawal, every moment the empath tried to bridge the emotional gap alone adds weight to their heart. Empaths try longer than anyone else, hold on longer than anyone else, believe in potential longer than anyone else. But even their compassion has limits. They don't walk away because they run out of love. They walk away because they run out of hope. And when that hope dissolves, silence becomes their last boundary. For the avoidant, this silence lands like a shockwave. They are used to emotional pursuit. To the empath, filling the spaces they leave empty. To the empath, being the emotional engine of the connection. They're used to the dynamic where their withdrawal leads to the empath giving more. So when the empath stops giving, stops explaining, stops reaching, something inside the avoidant shatters because this silence is different. It's grounded, it's calm, it's final, and the avoidant can feel that difference instantly. That acceptance hits the avoidant harder than any argument ever could. Arguments they can ignore, emotional conversations they can deflect, pleas for connection they can shut down, but acceptance? Acceptance is devastating. Acceptance means the empath no longer expects anything from them. Acceptance means the empath is no longer fighting to keep the bond alive. Acceptance means the avoidant is no longer needed to show up emotionally because you've accepted they never will. And nothing terrifies an avoidant more than realizing they are no longer being asked to try. Acceptance removes pressure, but it also removes purpose. It removes the avoidant's emotional safety net. It strips away the narrative that the empath will always be there. It forces them to confront the truth that the empath's silence is not a reaction, it's a resolution. And that resolution reveals the avoidant's greatest fear, not that you left out of anger, but that you left out of clarity. Avoidants collapse when they realize the empath didn't give up. They simply outgrew the pain. This is the moment where the avoidant begins to understand that the empath's silence isn't about punishment, it's about self-protection, it's about reclaiming energy, it's about choosing peace over emotional labor. The avoidant starts recognizing all the moments the empath stayed longer than they should have, gave more than they received, hoped for more than the relationship could offer. And suddenly, the avoidant sees the empath not as someone who was too emotional, but as someone who was strong enough to finally choose themselves. This realization is what causes the real collapse. Because the avoidant realizes the empath didn't walk away to hurt them. The empath walked away because staying was hurting themselves. And that truth is heavier than any silence. The avoidant sees, maybe for the first time, that the empath's love wasn't needy, it was consistent. Their efforts weren't excessive, they were generous. Their heart wasn't overwhelming, it was loyal. And now all that loyalty has gone quiet. Not because it died, but because it can no longer survive in a place where it isn't met. This is the moment the avoidant finally understands the empath didn't abandon them. The empath outgrew the pain of waiting. There's a moment in every avoidant empath dynamic that feels less like a breakup and more like a quiet shift in energy. A moment where the empath's heart doesn't harden, but finally closes. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of emotional self preservation. Avoidants rarely notice this moment when it's happening. They only recognize it after the silence stretches long enough that they can't pretend it's temporary anymore, because the empath wasn't pulling away to punish them. They were pulling away because they finally understood that staying meant losing themselves. And that's the realization the avoidant always understands too late. The silent goodbye. Empaths don't storm out. They don't create chaos. They don't demand one last emotional confrontation. Their goodbye is quiet, almost gentle. It doesn't come with warnings. It doesn't come with ultimatums. It comes with acceptance. Acceptance that the avoidant isn't ready. Acceptance that the connection has turned into emotional labor. Acceptance that love cannot breathe inside someone else's walls. And that acceptance is what finally creates the silence. The avoidant, who relied on distance to feel control, doesn't understand what this silence means at first. To them, it feels like another cycle. The same space, the same pause, the same emotional reset. But this time isn't the same because the silence isn't reactive. It isn't anxious. It isn't waiting for them to return. It's the empath's last boundary. Realization comes too late. It hits the avoidant slowly, then all at once. Something feels different. The energy shifted. The empath is gone, but not dramatically, emotionally gone. No more checking it. No more carrying the emotional weight. No more being the glue. And for the first time, the avoidant feels the emptiness they used to mistake for safety, because silence has a way of reflecting truth. And the truth is hard to avoid when there's no one left to blame, no one left to chase, and no one left to soften the blow of their own behavior. The moment that breaks them. Avoidants are used to disconnecting before they get hurt. What they aren't used to is someone disconnecting first, especially someone who stayed, understood, cared, and loved with consistency they never asked for but always needed. And that's the moment everything inside them unravels. When they realized the empath didn't leave to punish them, they left because the bond became one-sided. When they realized the empath didn't abandon them, they simply stopped abandoning themselves. When they realize the silence isn't anger, it's freedom. And freedom is the one thing the avoidant never expected the empath to choose. When the empath stops fighting for connection, the avoidant starts fighting with themselves. Because the silence the empath chose is the silence the avoidant feared most. Silence that doesn't wait for them. Silence that doesn't chase them. Silence that doesn't break for them. Silence that reflects exactly what their walls have cost. By the time the avoidant understands it, the empath is already healing, already transforming, already reclaiming their energy. And that's when it hits the avoidant hardest. They didn't lose the empath because the empath stopped caring. They lost them because the empath finally cared about themselves.